This is The World Unpacked. Welcome back to The World Unpacked. I'm your host, Doug. The invention of nuclear weapons by the United States ended the Second World War. The United States military bombed 2 Japanese cities and awakened the world to the apocalyptic, destructive power of this technology. In the years since, nuclear weapons have only become more powerful. Nuclear weapons and their proliferation simultaneously serve to make the world more stable and also much more at risk. States with nuclear weapons can use their deterrent capabilities to prevent or dissuade escalation into total war, but nuclear weapons can also serve to make other countries feel unsafe, creating security dilemmas that can almost guarantee conflict will occur. Despite the erosion of the nuclear arms control agreements that made the U.S.-Russia nuclear competition so stable, and despite the war in Ukraine, the United States and Russia remain on a relatively stable track with respect to their nuclear competition. So today's laboratory for nuclear instability is in Asia, where Pakistan, China, and India are caught in a web of decisions over their nuclear weapons that could limit sources of conflict or create the seeds of war and instability. Here to explain this complicated dance is Ashley J. Tellis, the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and Senior Fellow here at Carnegie. Here we go. Ashley, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be back.
I have to note we're recording in our brand new studio, so hopefully the audio will sound a little better for the listeners out there, and I'm glad you're my first victim in person.
It's a pleasure.
All right, so you've been working on the research that led to the report you just released for 2 decades, and one question I had was how you found the information that you did that went into this piece, because these countries aren't exactly famous for their transparency. So how did you get all this data about these countries' nuclear arsenals and policies?
I've been following China, India, and Pakistan literally since the early 1990s. And what I found surprising was actually how much information there is. The challenge is to sift the wheat from the chaff, because there are a lot of people writing and there is a lot of information, but not always accurate or authoritative. And that's where I think the interviewing and the conversations, particularly with scholars and leaders in all the 3 countries, complemented by conversations in the US and our European partners, were really useful. So the problem that I actually faced was not the absence of information, but actually selecting which pieces of the data were actually reliable and which could be used.
So the report's about, and it's titled, Nuclear Transitions. What is a nuclear transition, so we can set a baseline with our listeners here?
Well, it's an interesting question. If you use 1998, when India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons and declared themselves as nuclear weapon states, as a baseline, what defined all 3 countries at that time was a very simple view of nuclear weapons as useful for deterrence, period. And to put a finer point in it, they thought of their deterrence as being primarily minimal in some sense. And so the arsenal sizes were small. The weapons were focused mainly on targeting the adversary's cities, for most part, for purposes of retaliation. And no one had any bright ideas about, fanciful use of nuclear weapons. In the last 20 years, the transition that I'm talking about, what has happened after these early visions of minimal deterrence? How would you characterize the 3 nuclear arsenals in these countries today? And that's what the research focused on.
So I think we should start with perhaps the greatest transition, which is with China. China first tested their first weapon in 1964. They got there really fast, even compared to other states that were seeking nuclear weapons at that time. And they made the cutoff before the Non-Proliferation Treaty came into force in the 60s, so we're sort of grandfathered in as a nuclear state. What was their objective and strategy in their rush to nuclear weapons?
So if you look at the early Chinese nuclear strategy, it was very simple. They wanted a small nuclear force, and they believed that the simple presence of those weapons was sufficient to deter. Now, I argue in the report that that strategy worked because there were enabling conditions that were favorable to that strategy. And what were those enabling conditions? The United States and the Soviet Union, which were the principal players in the international system, essentially checkmated each other by deploying deterrence in the tens of thousands of weapons. So the kind of deterrence that China had to mount for its own protection was actually very modest. Now, what changed after the Cold War was that the Soviet Union disappeared. Its successor, Russia, is still around. But Chinese-Russian relations today are not what they were during the Cold War. They're not antagonistic. Instead, China became, slowly, a great power in its own right, and is now positioning itself to deal with another established great power, the United States. And so the Chinese transition is really defined by the reality that they are now at the core of the international system. They are a great power, and they face a great power that is really formidable, the United States.
The commander of U.S. nuclear forces says it's a game changer.
We are witnessing a strategic breakout by China. The explosive growth and modernization of its nuclear and conventional forces can only be what I describe as breathtaking.
With a history of having very sophisticated nuclear weapons for many decades. And so the Chinese expansion and transformation that we've witnessed in the last decade to a decade and a half is really a transformation that derives from the Chinese recognition that today there is no bipolar balance to protect China as it did during the Cold War. They have to look after their own security, and they are not going up against a minor nuclear power, but a formidable nuclear power.
So the Chinese are looking at the United States makes sense as a challenge to American global hegemony, but their neighbors are also a factor here, right? I mean, the Chinese develop a very aggressive nuclear weapons strategy to compete with the United States, but India and Pakistan also are looking around thinking, what are we going to do? So tell us a little bit about India. They first exploded the bomb in 1974, so they missed the cutoff, but they weren't a signee to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What was their objective and strategy in pursuing the bomb, and how has that changed?
So the Indian story is fascinating, and our colleague George Perkovich actually wrote the definitive history about 2 decades ago, and it still sort of stands the test of time. And the story goes in the following way. The Indians were mesmerized by atomic energy even before they became independent. And that was really the person of Homi Bhabha, who I think appreciated very early that the nuclear bomb was truly revolutionary. And being a good Indian nationalist, I think he wanted to make certain that India would never be denied the bomb. Except that he never had the opportunity to build the bomb in his lifetime, but he built the foundations for that bomb. And those foundations really were activated when the Chinese tested nuclear weapons for the first time in 1964. Until that point, there was a China-India rivalry, but it was largely a conventional rivalry. And India is not a pushover. It's a huge country. It has a large military capability of its own, and so on and so forth. So as long as the rivalry was conventional, India had the necessary antidotes to deal with it. Once the Chinese acquired the bomb, the Indian debate about whether India should acquire a bomb too really went into high gear. And for various reasons pertaining to domestic politics, the Indians never built their weapons fast enough to make the NPT cutoff in 67. And so the Indians test in 74. And that test actually was not a strategic test, and it was not driven by any strategic calculations. My own view, and I suspect George shares this to some degree, is that it was really driven by the pressures of domestic politics. When the then Prime Minister was in domestic trouble at home and thought, showing India's technological competence was a good way to gain domestic brownie points. But that, of course, then opens Pandora's box. Because when India tests a nuclear weapon, the international community gets agitated. An entire non-proliferation regime is built in response to India's nuclear weapons. And 2 other things happen in the external space. The Pakistanis begin to be worried that India is now a nuclear threat. and the Chinese begin to treat India as a nuclear threat. And so it contributes to a complication of the strategic environment. And from a Chinese point of view, India has never ceased to be a nuclear threat since. And in recent years, we've seen even more sophisticated Chinese weapons now developed to deal with a variety of Asian contingencies, of which India is obviously front and center because it has nuclear weapons.
This sort of conjures the image of the small fish running away from the fish trying to eat it, who's running away from an even larger fish trying to eat that fish. And Pakistan is perhaps in the unfortunate position of being the smallest fish, yet are a threat of their own, having developed their own nuclear bomb, as you mentioned, tested in 1998. So what's their objective and strategy as they look towards the Chinese and the Indians?
So for the longest time, they thought only of India as a nuclear threat that had to be countered. And from the time the Chinese begin to think, Pakistanis begin to think about nuclear weapons, which is 1971, the focus is India. But there are two sort of tangential elements that intersect. Pakistan and China make common cause against India very early because they have a common adversary, and that's New Delhi. And the Chinese play a very important role in aiding the Pakistani nuclear program. In fact, the Chinese sometime in the early 1980s transferred nuclear weapons designs. They transferred weapons-grade fissile materials. And since then, have transferred a whole slew of capabilities to the Pakistanis. But it sort of was clear because China had a beef with India. The Pakistanis had a beef with India, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so that alliance was understandable. What was more interesting was in the 1990s, particularly after crises in Afghanistan boiled out of control. And then after 2001, when the United States begins to get involved in Afghanistan, that the Pakistanis become more and more uncomfortable with the United States. And for a very intense period in the first decade of this century, began to look at the United States as a serious threat to Pakistan's nuclear weapons. And this anxiety peaked after the Abbottabad raid, when U.S. SEALs went into Pakistan and killed Osama bin Laden.
Today, at my direction, the United States launched a targeted operation against that compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan.
Because the Pakistanis inferred from that capability that Uncle Sam might one day choose to do something similar to their own nuclear weapons. And so after that Abbottabad raid, Pakistani anxieties about the United States grew. Pakistan began to diversify its storage of nuclear weapons to deter American attacks. It began to expand its own inventory, partly with an eye to India, partly with an eye to the United States. And for a while there, Pakistan even sort of pursued an ICBM program, the exact status of which today is unclear. But they went in that direction because they thought they might need some tools to deter the United States. So Pakistan is, as you said correctly, in a rather difficult spot because it lives next to a giant neighbor like India with whom it has political disputes that are not resolved yet. And it has these sort of inchoate fears about the United States and sometimes Israel. So there is enough in Pakistan's, history and in its experience to make it nervous about its environment.
I want to stick with Pakistan for a second. They may be credibly accused as having the weakest political system of the three countries we've talked about. And I know all political systems look strong until they don't, but Pakistan's recently been through a kind of an odd situation with their Supreme Court and with Imran Khan. They possess a bunch of nuclear weapons. Are they the real potential cause of instability and the big concern, not just in Asia, but for the United States?
Yes and no. I think the Pakistani use of its nuclear capabilities is the real problem, rather than the nuclear capabilities themselves. Now, let's back up a bit. If you looked at Pakistan, say, 10 to 15 years ago, the fears were that Pakistani security over their nuclear weapons was not good enough, that their weapons could leak to jihadi groups. the fears were that Pakistan was entertaining ideas of nuclear war fighting, that they had developed all these tactical nuclear weapons. And there was real concern that Pakistan might disperse its nuclear weapons early in the field to deal with the Indian threat. And that could result in a loss of control or people usurping control and so on and so forth. What I found in the course of doing the research was that Pakistan has actually improved its capabilities to deal with these challenges dramatically in the last 10 years. So today, Pakistani nuclear weapons are actually more secure than they've ever been historically. And what I found equally striking was that for all the song and dance about Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapons and the desires to fight nuclear wars with India, the Pakistanis actually do not have an appetite for any such stuff because they recognize that if they go down that path, they will bear the brunt of the costs. So in many ways, the report is a good news story about how far Pakistan has come with respect to its nuclear evolution. But what's the bad news? The bad news is because Pakistan is so petrified about India on one hand and has a peculiar kind of confidence about its ability to challenge India on the other, what the Pakistanis have settled for is a very provocative political strategy. And that provocative political strategy is to essentially support terrorist groups and insurgencies within India as a means of weakening India. And they're doing it under the cover of their nuclear weapons because they're now confident that they have so many nukes that the Indians cannot respond with either conventional war or nuclear war. But the problem with this strategy is that it sort of pokes the finger in the Indian eye with a certain regularity. And when things get out of control, then India feels tempted to retaliate.
So let's go back to India since you mentioned them. You've talked about in the report how they remain very consistent, and you describe them as conservative in their thinking on their nuclear program. How does that manifest itself, and where has that led them?
When I talk about the conservatism in the Indian program, I mean it in two ways. One, the Indians have a terrific infrastructure that would allow them to build up a much bigger nuclear force if they wanted to. And they haven't. And remember, they also read the same newspapers we do. They see the Chinese program expanding. They see the Pakistani program expanding. And they have still refrained from emulating them. And then the second is, in their doctrine, they hold on to a strategy of pure retaliation, which is, we don't have fancy objectives for our nuclear weapons. If you happen to use nukes on us, we'll hit you back and we'll hit you back hard. It's a very simple, almost simplistic notion of deterrence. And I think that is unique. I don't see that in the same way either in China or in Pakistan. And so it's conservative in that sense, and certainly conservative in comparison to China and Pakistan.
Let's talk about the Chinese strategy. They're famously no first use, meaning they will never initiate a nuclear exchange, only respond. And yet we've talked about how they're investing a huge amount of money in a huge variety of nuclear weapons that give them increased capabilities, not only in the region, but around the world. So is there a tension here between those doctrines and that strategy?
There's no tension in a principled sense, in the sense that you can have a very large nuclear arsenal and still be committed to a doctrine of no first use, right? Because the theory would say, I have these weapons, I have no intention of using them first. I just want to keep them as instruments of retaliation. And particularly because I'm going head to head with the United States, which is a formidable nuclear power, I have to assume that I will lose many of my own nuclear weapons in an American first strike. And therefore, I have to expand my arsenal to cater to that contingency. So in a strict sense, I think you can reconcile a large Chinese arsenal with a pretty steadfast commitment to no first use. But what is worrisome, to my mind, is less the expansion of the arsenal per se, and rather the dramatic efforts now being made to increase the responsiveness of the force. Now, I have to explain that
Yeah, what does that
by
mean?
explaining the character of the Chinese force during the Cold War. So the character of the Chinese force during the Cold War was something like this. It was a weak nuclear force. Any of China's adversaries could pick off the Chinese arsenal, literally, in a single spasm. But the Chinese were basically content that even if they had a handful of weapons that survived, they could inflict such nasty damage on the aggressor that that was good enough. Today, they've moved in a dramatically different way. They not only want to have a survivable fraction that is huge, so not just a handful, they want, many score weapons, in fact, many hundreds of weapons eventually, but they want to be able to respond with alacrity. And one of the things that DoD has flagged in recent years, which to me leaves me with the most uncomfortable element about the Chinese nuclear weapons program, is their willingness now to develop capabilities where they could use nuclear weapons even before they suffer the first strike. Now, how do they reconcile this with no first use, right? I think their calculation is, once we know that the adversary has launched nuclear weapons, we can still respond before those adversary weapons detonate on our soil. So now we are in a very fuzzy area about what constitutes first use, right? Now, the Chinese seem to be going in that direction. And they are building capabilities that in some ways will be quite vulnerable to US first strikes. And it puts them in a position potentially where they could be faced with that terrible use it or lose it dilemma. And so that's what worries me about the Chinese program, that their responsiveness of the force is increasing. The readiness at which they are maintaining certain elements is far above what we saw historically. And once the Chinese program reaches its maturity, you will have a significant number of Chinese nuclear weapons that will be in a straightforward, ready-to-fire condition. And, when you think about the future and the increasing intensity of US-China rivalry, that's not the best position to find ourselves in.
When we come back, I'll ask Ashley all about regional stability, U.S. security policy, and whether we're on the verge of a dangerous arms race in Asia. Hey, thanks for listening to the show. Are you looking for another great podcast? Let me recommend Aaron David Miller's Carnegie Connects. Carnegie Connects is our premier live podcast, and Aaron hosts big names from secretaries of state to CNN frontline reporters each week. Be sure to look up Carnegie Connects on any podcast platform. Now, let's get back to the episode. So I want to get into U.S. strategy because there's a lot of questions being asked here. But first, let's talk about sort of the regional view. This seems like a relatively stable situation, but I expect you have some ideas about what might destabilize it. So what concerns you about sort of the current situation of the triad, China, Pakistan, India, and Asian nuclear weapons competition?
So there are two dimensions that I want to talk about. One is the world outside Southern Asia and then the world inside Southern Asia. The world outside Southern Asia, the biggest concern I have is that the character of the Chinese arsenal will change in ways that allow more dangerous Chinese nuclear strategies to become possible. And let me explain that very quickly. Today, China's strategic systems, that is the systems aimed at the United States, are still systems that are designed primarily for retaliation. They're very inaccurate systems, and their greatest utility will be attacks in American cities. Now, people hearing this might think this is crazy. How can that be stabilizing, right? But in the peculiarity of nuclear deterrence, attacks on cities were traditionally considered stabilizing because they would deter crazy actions. Attacks on the opponent's nuclear forces were considered highly destabilizing because they would become tempting in case of a crisis. Today, China's strategic weapons are still aimed at US cities. But I fear that over time, China could move in the direction of increasing the accuracy of its systems. If it moves in that direction, then we are really teetering on the verge of trouble. Because then you have very accurate Chinese missiles aimed at very accurate US missiles. And the temptations to go first in order to avoid being taken out by the other guy become very acute. So the most important thing that I worry about when I think of the world outside Southern Asia is a Chinese shift from what in the trade is called counter-value targeting to counter-force targeting. Now, there's a parallel problem inside Southern Asia. Traditionally, the Chinese targeted regional actors primarily by going after large, soft area targets like cities. Today, Chinese theater nuclear forces are becoming incredibly accurate. Accurate to the point where they can actually take out very small adversary targets like military systems or even their own nuclear weapons. The only thing that prevents the Chinese from being able to execute such attacks today is that Indian capabilities, for example, are quite opaque. So you don't know where they are. But, the world is moving in a direction where information is becoming easier and easier to obtain. And if there comes a point where the Chinese could pierce the Indian veil of opacity, identify where their nuclear reserves are, and match those targets to very accurate offensive systems, then we could set the stage for some destabilizing moments, right?
So let's talk about the U.S. It seems to me very unlikely that the United States is going to do a lot to help Pakistan, given the complexity of the relationship in order to counterbalance China. So that leaves India. And you've got a couple ideas on how the United States might help offset its own security challenges with China by supporting the development of different sorts of Indian weapons. And I want to start with the weakness you point out in high-yield nuclear weapons in the Indian arsenal. You're saying that the security competition with China could heat up and the Indians might find out they want these. So first, what are they and why are they important? Why are they an important gap? And then second, what are your ideas for how the U.S. could help them perfect that weapon?
Well, the first question of why the absence of high-yield nuclear weapons is important, right? One of the things we learned during the Cold War were that hydrogen bombs or thermonuclear weapons were fantastic deterrents, because what you get in effect with a high-yield weapon is a one bomb, one city destructive capability. You don't need many weapons. One bomb takes out one city, and as long as that bomb can survive, you're in business. You're in the deterrence business. The Indians have a huge liability because their thermonuclear test in 1998 failed. And they consequently have to rely on what are essentially low-yield fission weapons. Now, the Chinese have large numbers of high-yield weapons. It doesn't matter in the course of day-to-day politics because nobody worries about these things. But if you imagine that Sino-Indian rivalries will intensify over time, as they seem to be, and if you imagine that we could have real crises between the two countries, then there may come a point when the Indian leadership begins to recognize that it needs to have comparable capabilities to that of China for purposes of deterrence. And the argument I make in the report is that suggests that one day India could go back to the business of nuclear testing. And that has certain implications for us because we want to prescribe nuclear testing. We are trying to bring the CTBT, which is a Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, into effect. And there is a peculiar issue with respect to India, which is we have a civil nuclear agreement, which we negotiated from 2005 to 2008, and which would be at risk if India went back to test. And so the argument I make in the report is that if we care about India having durable and effective nuclear capabilities, and we are confronted with the possibility of an Indian test in the future, we will need to rethink our policies as to how we respond in the case of that contingency. And that is really an important issue because it was one of the ambiguities that was left unresolved in the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement of 2005.
Ashley, I'm going to ask this question, and I hope the UN doesn't send a police force in here to arrest us, but isn't the United States helping India develop a thermonuclear weapon a violation of law, or at least of the desire to prescribe the proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world?
Well, we would not be helping the Indians develop a thermonuclear weapon. The Indians, I think, are quite capable of developing such a capability on their own. The only thing we would do is we would not penalize them for doing so. So there is a difference between active assistance and essentially a restrained policy response. And what I'm arguing for is a restrained policy response, because I think active assistance is simply ruled out by the fact that we are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the treaty prevents us from assisting the development of nuclear weapons in any non-nuclear weapon state, which India technically is under the terms of the NPT.
So another idea you have, which we've got to talk about, is the issue of the submarine-delivered nuclear weapons that India possesses. I take it that their submarine technology is not very good, or it's just okay. I believe they're built by the Russians, and they have a close relationship with the Russian military to help support those. You argue that India really should invest in this leg of the triad, right, in submarine-delivered nuclear weapons. And you even go so far as to say the U.S. could work with India or work through France with India to give the Indians some high-tech capability for their nuclear-armed submarine forces. Can you talk about why you think that's important?
Right. And this recommendation is anchored in what we discussed a few minutes ago, which is the potential shift in Chinese nuclear capabilities and the potential ability that China will have in time to hold at risk India's nuclear weapons, right? Because if we imagine the Chinese can identify India's nuclear weapon storage sites, and if you marry that to the reality of highly accurate Chinese missiles, then one must imagine a future where the survivability of the Indian deterrent, especially the land-based deterrent, will become questionable. And the only way to correct that is to go out to sea.
Indian Navy Chief Sunil Lamba has said that the Indian Navy has started a project to build 6 nuclear-powered submarines. He, however, has declined to disclose any further details on the project, calling it as classified. The move is, of course...
Now, I think India understands that completely. But it has had quite some difficulty in building an effective SSBN, a ballistic missile submarine force, because this is not easy technology to perfect. Anyone can build a submarine, but whether you can build a good enough submarine, that is a submarine that has a highly efficient nuclear reactor, that is extremely quiet in its operating regime, those are challenges that the United States took many decades to perfect. So the argument I'm making in the report is there will come a time where India, for reasons of the sheer survivability of its arsenal, will move in the direction of going to sea. It's already begun that. It is in America's interests that India have a survivable nuclear deterrent. Now, I'm not suggesting that the United States do what it did with Australia under AUKUS, because India is not a treaty ally of the United States. And I think the U.S. Navy would have a heart attack if I told them that we should be providing India with advanced nuclear reactors or compact nuclear reactors or what have you. But I think there is a cute way forward. And the cute way forward is to actually encourage the French to do it, because French nuclear propulsion technology is absolutely superb. And I think we owe the French one, because of the way we yanked the French away from the Australians through the AUKUS deal. My suggestion is that the United States, India, and France need to have a conversation about how this cooperation can take place. And the United States should do no more or no less than simply encouraging the French to move forward and consummate this cooperation with India. I think it's a win-win for both of them, and it's a win-win for us too.
I'm no nuclear expert, but I get to hang out with folks like you and Ankit, Toby, James, George, all of the great people in the nuclear programs here. And so I'm going to try to channel some of their thoughts now, which is to say, all of this sounds a little bit like arms racing to me. And I'd love to hear how you think we can manage this without ending up in Armageddon or with another Cuban Missile Crisis or something like that. How do we pursue this amidst this nuclear transition in Asia?
Well, I think we should not be afraid of arms races per se. What we need to worry about are certain kinds of arms races where the characters involved in the race have technologies that are not survivable, that are destabilizing in character, and that incite use rather than prevent use. And so if it is technological modernization that enhances survivability, I see that as a huge contribution toward deterrence. And if a competitive dynamic ends up providing or producing survivable forces on both sides, that's a good thing. And so my interest is in making certain that all the players involved in this game essentially end up with 1, survivable forces, 2, pursue nuclear strategies that are not provocative, and 3, build up their capabilities in the context of a political relationship that each enjoys with the other, that conduces to stability rather than induces provocation.
Ashley, thank you for coming on the show and talking through your thought-provoking report. We'll make sure to put it in the show notes, so go check it out. Thanks again.
Pleasure, Doug. Always happy to be with you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. Special thanks to Phi Slavianto, our intern, for this episode. See you next time.